find some seats. There are sort of individual seats interspersed all around. I'm Jessica Berman. I'm the director of the Drescher Center for the Humanities, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the Drescher Center to the first Humanities Forum talk of the spring semester. And I'm especially pleased that this is, we are presenting one of our own, Tim Nohe, from the Visual Arts Department in CIRCA today, and that we have a really standing room only crowd. I also want to thank our other sponsors, the Albin Kuhn Library and Gallery, the Visual Arts Department, and the Center for Innovation, Research, and Creativity in the Arts. As I said, this talk is part of the Humanities Forum series of events, and it marks the beginning of an ongoing conversation that we hope to have this spring. I want to encourage you to take a look at the other events in the series, either on this flyer, which we have available, or at Drescher Center website, dreschercenter.umbc.edu. I also want to invite you to attend the next Humanities Forum event. That's Wednesday, February 24th, 5:30 in this same space. The 9th annual Kuhn lecture, Why Have Intersex Rights Been So Hard to Secure in America? And that is going to be Alice Drager, who is a historian of science and medicine, speaking on why much more progress has been made on intersex rights abroad than in America. She argues that she will pay particular attention to the tensions existing between the pursuit of justice and the pursuit of truth, as well as the academic freedom issues surrounding research and activism. And that should be a really dynamic event, so I encourage you to come. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Earl Ellis from our Geography and Environmental Systems Department to introduce Tim Nohe.
Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much, Tim, for giving me a chance to intersect with your work, which I find is kind of the work I'd be doing if I were an artist, I think. But I'm not. I'm a scientist who studies global environmental change, and it's actually very easy to intersect with Tim's work and the way he's framed it especially. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but right now a big topic for environmental scientists is this concept that we humans have pushed the Earth so far into a new state that we now have a new epoch of geologic time, the Anthropocene, a period in which humans have emerged as a global force changing the Earth's system. There's many ways to view this, and you see some of the ideas just listed at the bottom there, and I'll talk a little bit about this. But I think the artistic vision and how that intersects with really the anthropological vision and the ecological vision of what humans are, what we are doing to the planet, is something that needs to be explored not just within any one part of the academy or in the public world, but really across all of them. So we commonly think about this transformation of the Earth as something relatively new and something relatively dangerous, and I think those are realistic ways to look at the way humans are changing the Earth now, with global warming pretty much becoming a runaway process. We're clearing lands across the world. We're making the Earth essentially more barren in some ways than it was before. But when we look a little deeper into what we humans have been doing to the Earth, we find that we've been doing it for a very long time. And here's a landscape that has been deforested, and underneath has been rediscovered what's called a geoglyph. And this is not the building foundation that it looks like. This is actually a ceremonial physical structure made in the Earth that's been revealed by deforestation. There's a deeper history, an ancient history of humans remaking nature, or cultures of nature that is ancient. The classic view that we come to an Earth, we're born onto an Earth in which natural processes have shaped everything, is no longer really a valid way of thinking about where we come from or where we're going to. The idea that people who lived in places long before us, before modern society, were somehow living there passively without changing anything, without making it theirs, is really not correct. If we think more deeply, and I think Tim has uncovered a lot of this as well, people of the past, hunter-gatherers even, changed the landscape. And this is just an example. This is actually an early agriculturalist. But in terms of reshaping the landscape, the burning of landscapes to make them more productive for hunting and foraging has been an old practice in Australia for thousands of years, remaking the landscapes there. Of course, the process of transforming the Earth has accelerated and become more intense and has really created places kind of beyond any natural pattern that we've ever seen before. We've really changed this whole natural pattern of the kind of the classic biomes of the tropical rainforests and the deciduous forests that would be around us today into new forms, such as agricultural lands that we see around us, or the urban lands that we see around us. We've connected the planet together in ways that have accelerated change, that have brought new things from place to place. And I think Tim's work really shows kind of how things have been juxtaposed in really rapid, almost catastrophic ways, brought together very quickly. And I think he's also showing a little bit about the notion that this classic story is that we just have a kind of a natural place disturbed by humans really needs to transition into this idea that we have long had humans transforming the landscape and that we're transforming it in different ways, and that really the nature that we create is the nature that exists today. And when we think about this, and this is something that I've focused more on recently, is the idea that not just looking at a place as being the way it is and staying the way it is, but thinking more proactively about how the place might become something different. And when we think about that, creating these new ideas, better places, we don't just have to think the traditional way. Instead of just creating more gray, hard infrastructures, tends to be the easy solution to modern life. We can create green infrastructures, things that change with us. And just to leave you with one more idea from this Anthropocene is another new idea from environmental science and ecology and biology. This idea that we're all connected to the biosphere directly in the microbiome, the organisms that live within us. We're all connected together. We all share some of these organisms. We're connected to the biosphere directly. Even in our modern societies, even in our built environments, we are still equally connected to the natural environment. Okay, with that idea, I'm going to introduce Tim. I don't want to take up too much time away from his fascinating exploration of what's happened in Botany Bay and the transition from the more aboriginal natures, the cultures of natures there, and into this kind of modern, intense industrial world that you now see in Botany Bay. And the first thing I should say about this, Professor Nohe has really created a labor of love here. This is 10 years of work in the making, so this is not a sudden act of creation. This is a pensée, a deep thinking of really the way a place has changed over a long period of time. So just some background on Professor Nohe. So he is an artist and an educator engaging in traditional and electronic media in daily life and public places. He was the recipient of a 2006 Fulbright Senior Scholar Award from the Australian American Fulbright Commission, and that's where he first got a chance to work in Botany Bay in Australia, and also an Australian American Fulbright Commission Fulbright Alumni Initiative grant in 2011. And so you can see this as this longer trajectory of 10 years since that to create this work. He is the founding director of the Center for Innovation, Research, and Creativity in the Arts, or CIRCA, and he's a tenured professor in visual arts at UMBC. Professor Nohe has strong ties to Australia, where he serves as an adjunct professor at La Trobe University, the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences as an artist in residence at the Center for Creative Arts at La Trobe University, and on the editorial board of the peer-reviewed journal Unlikely, based in Melbourne. All right, without further ado, I'd like to pass this on to Professor Nohe.
We'll have a little swap of technology. This is when things go wrong sometimes. So I will be talking about this exhibition, and I'd like to initially frame the work using some slides, and then I'm going to take you on a gallery walk so that we can actually respond to the space and respond to the content. But first, in Australia, when you come to an exhibition, you come to a public forum, you acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, so I would like to do that. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers are warned that the following lecture program and exhibition contains images of deceased persons. So I would just like to caution any people from Australia. And now to acknowledge country. I would like to acknowledge the Darwal, Bidigal, and Guigal people who are the traditional custodians of the land where I worked. I would also like to pay respect to the elders past and present of the nations. and extend that respect to other Aboriginal people who may be present. Today in Baltimore, we acknowledge and pay respect to the Piscataway, Lumbee, and Cherokee nations, the land where we stand today. So as Earl remarked, Botany Bay, this area is a kind of anthropic landscape. And in Botany Bay, we see this very large container ship coming forward. This is a great signifier of the globalized epoch that we live in right now. These are shipping containers that have made possible the great global trade and commerce that is taking place. But in Australia, it also leads to deindustrialization and the loss of jobs. And in the exhibition, you'll see some evidence of that. So we see this great influx of commerce. People all flow through this shallow bay. The principal airport for Sydney, the busiest airport in Australia, is literally in Botany Bay, built out onto artificial runways that have restructured and changed the wave actions of the bay itself. This is an ancient, dry, and fire-swept continent. It's a very tenuous continent to create human habitation. Aboriginal people have been on that continent for 60,000 years. It teems with biodiversity. This is a rainbow lorikeet. This is the kind of bird that you walk out to and say good morning to in the Sydney area. And the botanists on Captain Cook's mission of exploration in 1770 were struck by the wonder of the great biodiversity in this area. And as Earl pointed out, Aboriginal peoples, hunter-gatherer peoples, reshaped the land to suit themselves. And so one way that Aboriginal people shaped the land in New South Wales and other areas of Australia was with something they would refer to as fire stick farming. And so they would clear the land, the understory of forested areas or grasslands, with fire occasionally, and that would promote new growth. It would remove, as some people would refer to as rubbish, and would promote hunting in those areas. And so here you see a man about to launch a spear holding a boomerang, and a kangaroo fling, and another man about to throw a throwing stick or boomerang. So this area is swept by very direct change, driven by humans after the point of contact in 1770. That can come through disease like smallpox, but it also can come through building and industry. So this is a map from the late 19th century of Botany Bay, still showing areas around Botany Bay as heavily forested, heavily timbered, as still having swamp systems, still having interfaces with the bay itself, with the Georges River, with the Cooks River, and so forth. This is an image from about 4 years ago, and you can see the massive runways of Sydney International Airport, and here, this is Port Botany. So these huge artificially created islands, if you will, or peninsulas have jutted out into that bay, and you can think, well, that changes the shape of the bay, but it literally removes certain kinds of fish from the fisheries there. So at a later point in this exhibition, you're going to hear testimony from an Aboriginal leader referring to the previous generation's ability to lay down their spears at certain points in the harbor, go to their factory jobs, pick up the spears on the way home, and spear dinner on the way back to their families. Those fish disappeared entirely when these runways and these port structures went into the bay. So I'd like to frame this somewhat, and this is a quote from Maria Nugent, who's really a powerful thinker and historian, directly referencing the bay. And she says, "History itself is a conversation without end. Each generation begins its journey into the past by starting out from its own present." And so here we are today, exploring this past from our current presence, from our own lens of culture, from our understanding of the world as a global place, as a place of many languages. But as we explore it, you'll see that our notions of history are constantly being shaped, as you'll see in the cases and the images, by pop cultural references, by historical references, by our own notions of what nature is, by what culture is. And so here we are at Cornell. This is a good signifier of a past notion of Cornell as being the birthplace of modern Australia, where Captain Cook first stepped foot upon the continent and met Aboriginal people. But before I go forward, I really want to acknowledge the support that the project has received. You'll see many names here in this bulleted list. No artist works alone. We all stand on each other's shoulders. We all need each other in order to create and sustain ourselves. All of us as scholars and students require the support and give the support necessary to make work. And so I'd like to acknowledge the Australian American Fulbright Commission, University of Wollongong, where I was teaching, the Maryland State Arts Council, UMBC's College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, Hazelhurst Regional Gallery and Arts Center, which provided me with residencies year after year at the Hazelhurst Cottage, the UMBC Library Gallery, and Tom Beck, who had the great faith to offer me this opportunity to exhibit this work. I'm deeply grateful to you, Tom, and Emily Hopper, who has been instrumental working nights and weekends with me to present the ambitious show that you see here. I'd like to also thank the ongoing support of the deans of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, John Jeffries and Scott Casper, my department chairs in visual arts, Ben Grable and Permitted Jacob. In visual arts, Chris Paraguay is responsible for the lovely prints that you see here on the wall, and Christian Valente was instrumental in making all of the AV work in the space with loans and so forth. Jessica Berman and Rachel Brubaker have been tremendous supporters in the Dresser Center. And my interview subjects, you'll hear their voices in the space, you'll see some footage of them. This is a mix of people that, through the great chance of happenstance, I met and then extended out with conversation. Sometimes I would literally run into people and they say, "So, you don't sound like you're Australian, what are you doing here?" And then I would introduce myself and they'd say, "Do you know Jim Tower? He's an oyster farmer." And I'd say, "No." And they'd give me his phone number and off I'd run with that information. So thanks to these subjects, David Barker, who's an oyster farmer, Les Bursell. If you see OAM next to somebody's name, that means they have won the Order of Australia merit. And that's the equivalent of receiving a knighthood in Australia. So Les Bursell has received one as an Aboriginal knowledge keeper. Bernie Clark is an environmentalist and fisherman. Chris Ingray, David Ingray from the La Cruz Aboriginal Land Council. Kate Milner, Linda Noonan, Jim Tower, and Bob Walsh. And of course, my family supported and tolerated me going away for long gaps in young children's lives, and I'm very grateful to them for that. So you're going to see images, sounds, you're going to hear stories, and I'd like you to get a sense of this place through what you see and what you hear. And so first I'm going to kind of come back to a point that Earl made, and that is to describe how one relates to the land, how you relate to country, how you position yourself in relation to your environment. And so this is Les Bursell speaking to us about how he positions himself in relation to land and country. And country is a very specific definition for Aboriginals in Australia.
We don't own the land, we are part of the land. And we aren't here to prosper from the land, we are here to work in harmony with the land.
I'm tempted to play that again because it's so pointed. I'll play at least the first phrase.
We don't own the land, we are part of the land.
Okay, so you have to imagine that you're not an owner of the ground that's under you, that you are part of that. So as Earl was saying, if you think about the way the biome works, the joy that gardening gives you, the way that dirt enriches your living body, you come closer to this understanding of your relationship to Earth, to this place that we inhabit now. So I'm going to now play a clip from Bob Walsh, and you see here in this photograph a kind of typical Botany Bay juxtaposition. We see powerboats, these things are sometimes called tinnies there. You see a wharf taking petroleum products out to tankers, and then you see a replica of the Endeavour, Captain Cook's ship, all juxtaposed in one space in April of 2007.
Well, Botany Bay is a big bay. When Captain Cook came here, he wasn't aware of the existence of Sydney Harbour, which was only a short distance by sea away because it has a rather narrow entrance. He thought that Botany Bay was remarkable, and it is remarkable. If it had been the only harbour for Sydney, it would be cared for scrupulously. But I'm afraid that because Sydney Harbour was there, it gets the favoured treatment, and Botany Bay tends to be treated as the tradesman's entry point to Sydney.
This is not just by opinion, this is by legislation. So in the 19th century, there was an act of Parliament in New South Wales that stated that this should be the noxious reserve of Sydney. This would be where the fellmongers were, this would be where the soap makers were, this would be where the plague hospitals were, this would be where the cemeteries were, because they were all considered to be polluting industries. They would be shunted off from Sydney to this area. This is Bernie Clark. Grew up as a fisherman, went off to war during World War II, a very tough generation, and then became an environmental activist, defying refineries, defying desal plants, defying different types of intervention in the Bay. And there we are.
Now, all right, that's our history. You see, on the footsteps of Banks and Solander, they are our two great botanists, is a tangle of pipes and oil tanks and so on the footsteps of our English forebears. Other countries have spent millions preserving the historic site. We've spent millions burying ours.
So one thing that I want you to see here, one piece of information that I use, I relate to the archive. And the archive exists in Tom's special collections. It exists in eBay, it exists in Google Earth. When we look down from Google Earth, here, we can see that the Caltex oil refinery has gone from a refinery that creates petroleum products in Australia to one that imports them. We see the Continental Carbon Factory that used to contribute carbon to the manufacture of tires in Australia being literally wiped from the map when tires were no longer manufactured in Australia. So with global trade, with containerization, with imports coming from abroad, with cheaper labor and so forth, those industrial jobs flee the country. This is not just something that happens in the United States or in Europe. This is a global phenomenon. Capital chasing the lowest possible price point on labor. This is by Chris Ingray. He is the CEO of the La Perouse local Aboriginal Land Council. He's speaking to that time past when his uncles and others could spear fish in the bay.
I was talking to an old uncle who said how they used to walk along the foreshore in the morning and leave their spears up towards Botany Way, walk back in the afternoon spearing the fish along the shoreline, and when I was talking to him he said no, you can never do it now because of the ports and things that are in there now, where he used to, a few men used to go over work in the morning, on the way back they used to walk back in knee-height water spearing fish for their food, for their families that night, so yeah, a lot has changed.
So this isn't just simply hunting and gathering, this is cultural knowledge that becomes lost. There's a cultural break that occurs when decisions are made in terms of planning to reshape the land that we hold, that we are stewards for. So I'm going to play one section of the sound that is normally inside the space. If you think about the volume of the gallery, it's not just the walls, it's actually the sound space within it. And the audio here completes the work. It is the work. It is the sound of the space, it's the sound of interview subjects. And in this particular movement called Clapping In, it points very directly to a period of Aboriginal stewardship and immediately jump cuts, if you will, to the contemporary. And so you're going to hear these men welcome to country the remains of ancestors that have been held in galleries and museums as anthropological curiosities, as racial curiosities. And the Land Council has been working to bring these remains back to country to further the renewal of the Bay. Within their religious constellation, they don't think the Bay can be whole until everyone has come back to country to be laid to rest in country. And so you see body parts here, literally skeleton body parts wrapped in native paper bark. You see throwing sticks and boomerangs and spears, and this is a smoking ceremony. And so you're going to hear these men welcome these remains back to country in the beginning after a very stormy period. And literally when I took part in this repatriation ceremony, a huge storm swept through the bay. We were supposed to move from La Cruz across the water to Tower Point, a nature center, to inter these bodies. And we were unable to, so we had to take four-wheel drives through a muddy track into this nature reserve, and every one of those trucks became bogged down and were unable to reach the burial place, so we all had to walk in and walk out. And for the people doing this ceremony, they said the old ones have made us understand how difficult their journey was by making our journey as difficult as theirs was, so that we all had to take part in this struggle in order to come back to country. So I'll play this for you. So to jump ahead a little bit.
And I just remember thinking how isolated and far away it was from Sydney. I mean, just being so surprised that where could we possibly kind of be going? You might have done it, that drive from the middle of Sydney, that just kind of keeps going down Anzac Parade and goes further and further and further, and there's less and less and less kind of built up areas. And it's like you arrive at the bay. I mean, the road just kind of ends at the heads and the water. And you just think both kind of how beautiful the ocean is, and how different it was from, how completely different it is from the city that you've been at. So I was kind of, I was surprised. That was my first impression. And then, because it just does open out in front of you when you get to the end of the road.
framing for the exhibition of going to this pre-contact time to a point where 747s are taxiing by, and you can hear air traffic control through the radio frequency scanner that I used to capture the on-air traffic that was all around me. So one way to think about environment too is that we're constantly being interpenetrated by data, by radio frequency information, by cell phone calls, and we're not even really aware that that's part of our environmental envelope, that this electronic information is sort of surging through all of us right now without us really regarding it in any way. So that takes me to methods. So over time, I worked and walked the Bay, and for me, one reason that I wanted to do a gallery walk with you is that walking is really about directing attention over time. It's a longitudinal study, it's a time study, it's a human rhythm that goes into a work. And so I worked in that field with different kinds of technology, which rapidly changed while I was doing this. So I moved from digital audio tape recorders to solid state recorders. I went from point and shoot cameras that were 5 megapixels to things that were 15 megapixels, as if that somehow changed things. But I needed to travel lightly so that I could notice and attend to things rather than be burdened by the technology and serving the technology in a way. So it's not a photo show in wavy quotes per se, it's a noticing show. And occasionally I did have run-ins with the law. People do wonder about things like this. So just after I took my kind of art school photo where somebody artfully wrote yes with highway yellow paint, I was interrupted by some nice police officers who insisted that I wipe my data card of all the pictures that I had just taken of the liquid storage facilities and so forth. So I went through about 100 pictures, deleting them all while they stood over me, thinking, I don't want to wind up in an Australian jail tonight so far away from my family. So one important thing, as I remarked earlier, is the way that the work, all photography in a way, immediately becomes about the past and relates to the archive. That's why I very much wanted to do this show here because of its relationship to special collections. So I, through the internet, was able to plumb the databases of the Mitchell State Library in New South Wales, the National Library in Canberra, and find images of this period of the invention of photography, and before that, through engravings and so forth, that told the story of the Bay. And so these are photographs of a man named George Cann who put on snake shows every Sunday at La Perouse as a sort of tourist attraction. His son, in terms of time continuity, a thread of time being pulled forward, he acted on these shows. He did these shows until he retired in 2010. So I was very interested in these kind of continuities of place, the way that we have a hold in a certain kind of place. Our hold in the United States is very much broken by movement and so forth, but some families, like the Cann family, stayed put. Aboriginal families, as we'll see up front, stayed put. I was also really interested in eBay as a sort of pop culture ephemera search engine. And so these are different imaginings of Captain James Cook, some from an American standpoint, some from an international standpoint. We see here Homer Simpson as Captain, the good captain. We see Captain Cook being lauded here with his connections to the United States. So his discovery, if you will, of Alaska, his discovery, if you will, of Hawaii, the tie between the endeavor as a mission of exploration to our own efforts in exploring space through the space shuttle program. And so here we see a mission patch of the Endeavour. The Endeavour was also an Apollo capsule that went to the moon. So the real themes that you're going to see, especially far forward in the room, are these ties, these enduring ties to the land, the way that people would choose to stay on the land and work for colonial settlers in order to stay in their traditional country. So here you see an Aboriginal group holding on to their home country traditions, and the Cooks River. This is sometimes known as the last of the Cooks River tribe. These are all workers who work for a huge landowner named Thomas Holt. And I also do some geospatial work through Google Earth, and so I'm going to introduce you to some spaces through Google Earth very quickly and then take you on this gallery walk. I know we're very big and cumbersome, but we'll herd cats and make that happen. So this is Botany Bay, and I'm going to kind of zoom through some of these spaces, talk a little bit about some of them. This is a broad overview. We're going to zoom down to Cornell. You'll see that this area of the bay is not as built up as the North Shore. There's a very large nature preserve called Tower. You'll see big lakes. Those are artificial lakes. There used to be 400-foot tall sand dunes there. All of this land was owned by Thomas Holt and his family. They literally carted away those dunes to make the mortar of Sydney. And so they're brackish lakes now. You'll see these areas, these lakes, being filled in with garbage and then being filled in with suburbs. This is the North Head. And so here you can see the great outcroppings of the airport and the port, and this is the most industrialized part of the bay. This is where the factories that leach mercury into the groundwater are. This is where the cemeteries are and so forth. Tower is wetland, so this is salt marsh, mangrove, oyster farms. The Georges River flows into the bay and brings algae down to the oysters. I'll zoom out a bit so you can see what a substantial river system that is. The foreshore suburbs were very heavily populated in the 19th century with the advent of railroads. Sydney Airport is built out and is literally the oldest international airport in the world, the oldest airport in Sydney. These 3 massive runways serve international traffic. That river that you see bending around should have a very artificial looking bend to it because it's been rechanneled to serve human needs. And that's the Cooks River. The Alexander Canal and all of these blocks of white are industry. This is so toxic that no fish or shellfish can be harvested from it, and there are warning signs everywhere for it. Let's see if we can do it now. Perhaps not. This is when technology fails. Okay, let's do it manually. I may have to skip this. All right, I'm going to have to skip this. Let's see if I can just at least zoom out. All right, I'm going to abandon that. Departing from our planned scheduled program. What I would like to do, though, is ask everybody to stand, if you will. Get a little bit of field trip. We're going to go to the front of the gallery.
Well, I feel like I should have one of those UMBC, walkie-talkie packs that they have. So in the introduction of the show, what I'm trying to establish here is a period before settlement, and these panels, an epic of Aboriginal stewardship. You literally see here the bounty of the bay through this great shell midden. So these are literally the garbage dumps of Aboriginal people. It shows where campsites were good, where you could actually harvest well. These are engravings that were on the rocks in sandstone in La Perouse, and these would be used for initiation. They would be used for celebration. They would be used for astronomical observation. And you see different aspects of life taken in the early years of the Sydney colony before the tribes of this area had been thoroughly decimated by smallpox, by warfare, by separation of family. This section shows what happens, the dissolution that happens after European settlement. So here in the first panel we see a man named Pemulwuy, who is known as a freedom fighter and organized the first armed resistance against the British. He was eventually captured and run down after 12 years, shot. His head was cut off and was sent to Joseph Banks in a barrel of spirits as a sort of ethnographic trophy. Another thing that happened in this time of conflict was the wave of smallpox that devastated the people here. And so you see funerals, you see people going into grave sites to die. Then a great rounding up that happens, as it happened here with Aboriginal people in North America, it happened there in Australia. You see children being taken from their families and sent to live with Anglo-Australians. And so this is a little girl who's been taken from her family. This is referred to in Australia as the stolen generation. And so there's a severing of cultural knowledge that occurs, a loss of language that occurs, a great disruption that happens in this time period, which doesn't really end until the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s. Australians didn't even give Aboriginal people a right to their own land until 1992 in the Eddie Mabo decision. Okay? This country also has said sorry to Aboriginal people in a way that we have not in our country for the slaves who were indentured in the United States. So this area sort of establishes that. This case all points to the revival of cultural knowledge among Aboriginal people. And so these are books that have been produced mainly by Les Bursell to produce knowledge of bush tucker, food that could be taken from the landscape, words for plants, words for parts of the body, words for ceremonies, so that that cultural knowledge could be revived. Here we see different framings of colonialism, the many different kinds of pop ways of understanding and commemorating, some through official channels like coins and stamps, some through graffiti. Okay? This case replicates that very much, the different kinds of commemoration, different kinds of culture of commemoration. Here we see different kinds of commemoration and pop understanding. So Botany Bay in people's imagination was the place where the prisoners of the jails of England, all of those prisoners could no longer be kept in the UK, couldn't be sent to the United States anymore, were shipped abroad to this great land to the south, the land that Captain Cook had claimed on behalf of the Crown. They seized this land using a process called terra nullius. They said basically no one lives here, ignoring 60,000 years of Aboriginal occupation, ignoring 60,000 years of stewardship, and seized the continent. Now Botany Bay is this place of first colony, this imagination space of what it would be like to be transported for selling moldy bread or stealing a piece of rope or something like that. Crimes that were petty enough not to have you swing on the gallows, but noxious enough to send you abroad. Or also people who were engaged in sedition, people who were rabble-rousers, who were political prisoners basically, who were dumped from Scotland, who were dumped from Ireland, dumped from England. And these stories tell that in some way. So whether we're reading that history through the lens of Scooby-Doo or commemorative sculpture or through stamps, they all tell that story in a different way. Botany Bay is even turned up in Star Trek episodes. You know, so the Wrath of Khan is about Botany Bay, strangely enough. Okay, so all of these different weavings occur. It's a very dense kind of fabric. In this section, I'm referencing a kind of aboriginality that understands that it's a commodity in some way, that responds to the tourist trade, that sells aboriginality to people in order to sustain the community. And so these are various boomerangs. So boomerangs were sold to tourists at Botany Bay at La Perouse from about the 1880s forward. And they were manufactured within families like the Sims family or the Timbury family. And that was handed down from generation to generation and generation. So in this case, you actually see a kind of mass manufacture for tourist goods when manufacturer moves into plywood rather than traditional ironbark or mangrove. You see that reproduced here. Within Aboriginal culture, there's also a division of work and ceremony between men's work and women's work. And you also see that in artifacts for tourists. So men's work would encompass things like clapsticks and throwing sticks and boomerangs and woomeras and bull roarers. Women's work would be shell work. It would be different kinds of cloths. It would be different kinds of painting. And so those divisions are seen in those tourist trade items as well. On the splash wall that you see here, we see the bay changing over time. And so we have Captain Cook's map from 1770, this 19th century map that shows a relatively untouched south and north head. The quick partition of that space in the 20th century, and from about 2003 before the port has been expanded even yet another time. Okay? So we're going to all head that way, because this is a section that responds to the modernization, the flip of the coin, if you will. Like me, you enter the international airport that services 35 million people per year. So imagine that kind of human traffic. There is a constant choreography of jets there. One takes off every 2 minutes. And so in the ear, it competes constantly with lorikeets. It competes constantly with cockatoos and the waves and so forth. And so in the audio that you hear, there's a kind of wash of aircraft over your head constantly too. But you can literally get from about here to about where that blue screen is there and make photographs of jets taking off to and fro. There's actually an airport observation beach. This portrays Port Botany, and this expanded to a brand new stevedore in the time that I was there, anticipating additional global trade. The kind of untold story of all of these containers, these units that are 20 to 40 feet long, and then are shipped out by rail or by truck once they've arrived, is that they come full of goods, but most of them leave the country empty. And that's because Australia has started to move towards a service economy, an economy that does not manufacture, that only exports raw goods like coal and uranium, but doesn't actually manufacture its own goods for export per se. And so a lot of these things go back abroad empty. Going down here, this is a good snapshot of extractive economy in Australia. I referenced earlier the dunes that were on the Cornell Peninsula, 200 feet high, 300 feet high, covered in heavy stands of old-growth timber. Thomas Holt received an entire 100 miles of the Cornell Peninsula, owned it wholly. Clear-cut all of the wood. When the wood was clear-cut and was gone, ran sheep and cattle. When the cattle and sheep failed, brought in grass to try to hold on to the shifting dunescape. Dunescape could not be held onto. Brought in bush from South Africa to stabilize the dunes. And those bushes have now encroached upon the entire ecosystem of the bay, all of New South Wales in their spread, because they're spread by birds. These dunes needed to be stabilized because Holt mined them. And so you see the carting away of sand, you see the dumping of rubbish, and you start to see the foundation of suburbs that would be built into these lands. Okay? You also see points in which people use this land not for extraction, but for recreation. And so you see four-wheel drive access, you see photo shoots, you see the multiple films that have been shot there. Mad Max was shot there, for instance. You see people literally pushing truck tires up the dunes as a kind of active Sisyphus, kind of doing cross-training with a truck tire. And again, satellite images to prove that this is a time-scaled event. And this is an event that happens in the brief time that I've worked at, not in Bernie Clark's 83 years, but in my years. This entire section is speaking to what I addressed as the great, dry, fire-swept continent of Australia, anticipating that Sydney would be water insecure, that the dams would not have enough capacity to grow to keep up with its growing population. The state pushed through infrastructure law that would build a desal plant. Neighbors throughout the peninsula, throughout the bay, protested this. You see signs of protest here. You see signs that say things like, "Save the bay, no $2 billion white elephant." You see the structure being built, and I call this the tail of the white elephant, because now that this thing has been built, it's been sitting idle for 3 years because the dams are now at or over capacity. And so you see these Jersey wall barriers dropped at the gates because the plant literally is not being used. It's being mothballed for the cost of about $534 million. So perhaps in 10 or 15 years, Sydney will demand this water, but right now it's sitting inactive. Okay? So this is the kind of rapidity of change that I could respond to just in this very brief longitudinal study that I did with this piece. So these all point to different kinds. I'm flipping the coin again because I like balance. I'm a Libra. I'm flipping the coin over and pointing to a period of sustaining groups and tribes and clans with fishing moving into contemporary fishing. The period of commercial fishing in the bay completely collapsed in the early 2000s. Commercial fishing is banned now, but recreational fishing still takes place. The people that you see on these rocks are alluded to here in my didactic panel. Many people coming from Sydney in order to fish here, some people dying on these rocks because they're swept away by the massive waves that come. And you can see the waves crashing here, people not wearing life jackets and so forth. This is in an area in La Perouse called the Loop. You see different kinds of recreation use. You see a 19th century fort that was meant to project the power of the Australian Army here, but also to protect the back door to Sydney and to protect the coal mines that were in this area from the Russians who they thought would encroach in this area. This thing becomes obsolete almost immediately and then becomes a old age home for imperial soldiers of the empire. It also becomes a movie set for Mission Impossible, which Australians love to point out. You see it used for divers, you see it used for weddings, you see it here in the 19th century, you see it here today. This is my friend John Cann. John has a couple long-necked turtles in the National Aquarium. He would love you to go see them. He's very proud of that. He is the last of the Cann family generations to put on snake shows in La Perouse. Here is his father, George Cann, holding red-bellied black snakes. Very deadly snake, don't step on them. This is one in the Coast Hospital Cemetery. I almost stepped on this particular guy mistakenly. But would put on these shows that were very educational, very fun, and were a tradition of the place. That tradition is largely gone from this place, again, in the snap of a finger. Within this screen, what I'm trying to do with the video is sort of make ties of all the information that's being woven here, to try to give information about the sites, to fill in some of the blanks, if you will. And the sound that's in this central space has a similar kind of function. I'm going to cross over. If you feel like you've fallen into an open book, you have. I really do think of this in a way as a book. The didactic panels is describing the information that you see, that you're reading and returning to a story that's very complex. So these are developments on the dunes that we saw just above. This is an area called Green Hills Beach that used to be virgin forest, then became a trash tip of construction waste, then became a suburban development. You see suburban developments all along the foreshore in the 19th century and different kinds of buildings from the 19th century buildings that are being crowded out. These rather forlorn 19th century homes here are worth about $3 million. And that can tell you what the economy of housing is like in Australia right now. These are various pictures of that suburban stretch. This wall is all related to the pollution of the bay. You can't have development without having sewage. And the sewage is literally pumped out, semi-treated into the ocean. Okay, so these things I refer to and friends refer to as the stink pipes kind of sneak along and wend their way out to the Cronulla wastewater treatment facility. They get piped out to a tip into the ocean, basically. So imagine flushing your toilet, a little bit of treatment happens, whoosh, out to sea. Imagine, though, that pipe is only a few kilometers away from the intake pipe for the desal plant and the kind of things that can go wrong there. And those things have gone wrong. Another unseen kind of pollutant is the industrial waste of all the industries that we saw on the North Shore. And so you go to certain areas like this Penryn estuary wetland that are so heavily contaminated by mercury that you're not even allowed to swim there, you're not allowed to wade there, you're not allowed to take fish there. Unfortunately, this is also the last habitat for wading birds on this part of the shore. Okay? This is the section that I showed you in a slide earlier of deindustrialization. And I'm going to wind you around this way. So what we see here is beautiful Hawkesbury sandstone. And we see a family and we think they're out on an outing on a weekend in the 1930s. What we're actually looking at are people who carved out a very tentative existence during the Depression years and built shacks into these walls because they had no place to live. And so what we're looking at here are the fittings from those shacks that literally held them to the cliffs to keep them from tipping into the ocean, into the Tasman Sea or into the bay. And we also see these little reservoirs that have been carved into these natural arcs. And these arches have basins in them, and the basins hold fresh water because people would take water from these and cook up some tea, brew up some tea from these things, and they still work to this day, well after the 1930s. People hung on to these little shacks until the 1970s when the national parks pushed them out. So 40 years of habitation in this very tentative way. This section points to the old way of thinking of Botany Bay as the noxious reserves. Hospitals for leprosy, smallpox, bubonic plague here, and a very closely adjacent cemetery for nurses and doctors who fell victim to those diseases, as well as the patients who died there. And then a massive, what I would refer to as a city of the dead, over 65,000 graves in the Eastern Memorial Cemetery Park on that shore. Very often the graves, if you can still find a marker, will allude to culturally the passing into death as fell asleep, who fell asleep on this date, for instance. And so imagine our dear departed Supreme Court Justice who passed in his sleep recently, who fell asleep. So this is what I would refer to as little n and big N nature. These are the remnant areas of the natural world that may be found in Taura, may be found on the heaths of the national park. You see these light boxes that are meant to draw your eye to the wonder of botany there. This is what the botanists Daniel Solander and Joseph Banks celebrated on the endeavor, this great upswelling of botanical and faunal diversity. As we look around, we see different, very specific landscapes, from heaths to dunes to mangrove swamps to a particular kind of tree that was celebrated by Banks, the Banksia, named after Joseph Banks, of course, the good Lord. And there's a character at the end called the Banksia Man, who would, in a series of popular stories, would run away with your children if you had gone off into the bush. And so one of those cautionary, scary tales like the Brother Grimm. What you see here is probably my favorite story of the Bay. It points to the first and the surviving industry there. And so if we think of fisheries as an industry, this is the fishery of oyster farming. So as soon as oysters were discovered, they overexploited them immediately. Okay, so the very large oysters that you see in David Barker's hands down here are overexploited, and the population completely crashes because they're eating them, but they're also burning them in lime kilns in order to make cement. So they're overexploited, they're gone, they're wiped out. So then people like Thomas Holt, there of the gray beard, starts to do oyster farming with rocks out into the bays. And you can still see these 19th century farms, and also put timbers out. They started farming a commercial oyster, the Sydney rock oyster, and it does incredibly well. Farmers sustain themselves. We have 57 farmers working in the 1960s. Then QX, a disease, enters the picture, wipes them all out. So that bloke that you see there in that old oyster depot is Jim Towert, and he's heard in the audio recordings here. And he talks about this time in his life when he was an oyster farmer up to his waist in mud, being the best years of his life, being out in the sun and the mud doing this very hard work. And as you walk out to Taura, you see the evidence of this industry all around you in old oyster racks, shell roads, etc., even punts that are still out in the water. There are only 2 remaining oyster farmers left. David Barker and Helen Barker there, who are standing, are the 2 left in this entire watershed, and they have, using their knowledge of aquaculture, Dave's aquaculture scientists, are now reintroducing that extinct mud oyster into this bay for the first time in over 100 years. And so this is a story of great renewal. This is the thing that gives me some hope about this place, that people can renew their ties to the land, as we saw in our Aboriginal vocabularies and ceremonies, but also in the way that people can revivify industries that were thought to be dead. And so you see his farm there in that lower panel as an active business, as an active concern, raising these animals in the watershed. And I want to show you one other thing in the far corner, and then I take questions and so forth. So these last 2 panels, which are sort of in our nature section, show the interface between the human-made. Here we see that sewage outfall pipe going out into the ocean in this area that used to be pristine dune. And then we also see those dunes being treated for invasive plants. So the things that we humans carry with us can include foxes and domestic cats and dogs and rats and decorative plants or plants that are meant to sustain dunes that then get out of control. And so this plant called lantana is something that you can pick up at any Home Depot or Lowe's and put outside. In Australia, where there's no frost, this thing grows in great hummocks over native vegetation and literally chokes it to death. And so people literally have to dig this out and pull this out or spray herbicides onto it. When you spray herbicides onto it, that affects all of the other parts of the ecosystem, the faunal parts of the ecosystem. And so these sections are all showing various kinds of plants that have made their way from South Africa, that have made their way from New Zealand, that have made their way from the United States, that have made their way from the UK, hitching a ride with us to this continent that did not have these plants until settlement. Okay? So these things that we pack with us, these plants from Mexico, can become also clues to past settlement. So if you see these plants out on the dunes, that meant that there may have been a home there at one point. Okay? That's a huge brain dump.
What's next with this body of work?
Well,
Are you planning to extend it? Are you planning to show it in Australia?
I have shown this in Australia in 2010 in a version that I could roll up and put in a tube and bring on a plane, so it was much smaller. As I said, it feels like I'm walking through a book, and so in a sense I want it to be a publication. But that will take time and fundraising and so forth. But I feel like it's a piece that wants to relate to the future and to the past in the way that a book can. Yeah.
Two things. One, may I offer as a suggestion that if you want to get this out there with some measure of urgency, but you don't want to bother with all the financial implications of a publishing house, you could always kickstart it or publish it independently or as an electronic text.
That's how Tom first saw it.
And
I think Jessica has to.
I was just going to interrupt and ask if maybe we could take the
Sure,
Q&A
of course,
where
of course.
everybody can hear.
Yep.
Can I finish asking your questions?
yeah, I was gonna say, are you in the arts or the sciences again?
I am in the arts.
So you're photography.
I was trained as a photographer, and then in my master's degree I got something just called visual arts, which meant it was a big grab bag.
And And
Happily so.
so to that end, I imagine you chose Botany Bay because of its particularly tumultuous ecological history and cultural history. Would you do this? Have you ever considered doing this elsewhere by any chance?
I could easily do this in Curtis Bay here in Baltimore. I could easily do this at the Great Salt Lake. I could easily do this in the Thames estuary. This is a global story, and so it can be told anywhere if we look carefully.
True.
And over time. Yeah.
It's beautiful. So bravo, and
Thank you.
thanks for your talk. So for me, the exhibition really begged the question of how information accumulates through visuals and sound and pedagogy. You were leading us through how it all accumulates to a body of knowledge. So there's sort of an epistemological aspect to the exhibition that I'm not necessarily accustomed to in art exhibitions. So what I'd like to know is, what do you feel you have brought to an epistemological approach as an artist? What were your artistic choices? How could you do this whereas somebody else could not have?
I feel like there's certain kinds of patterns that artists match. There's certain ways that we use visual and sonic material to create meaning. And there are certain kinds of acts of recognition that take place when you're in the bush, when you're in the archive, when you're on the search engine. And that may not be at the top level of your consciousness, but it starts to fit out a match of pattern. And as you literally meta tag your photographs in a software like Lightroom, you start to enter these little key phrases, and I'm sure all of my humanities friends do something similar, so that you start to see a story emerge. So the nouns start to emerge. The action of your verbing the landscape emerges, but the prose is not there yet. And so how do you find the prose? And I think the prose is in the installation. The prose is walking in the space, but also right now I'm the intermediary telling the story. And that's what I feel a future book might be able to do. It might be able to suture together the strands that are not quite tied together yet and would need to be by having that kind of long-term relationship with the page, the long returning to something, or the thing that triggers a desire to go deeper to find out something for yourself. So when I think of somebody's work like Kim Stringfellow's at the Salton Sea, not only did I enjoy her book, but I was motivated to find out more about the Salton Sea, to do my own sort of deep dive into that landscape through her work. And so I would like that same kind of trigger to happen so that you can reimagine this place, but you can also reimagine Curtis Bay or the Gowanus Canal or lots of other places that are equally complex and fraught. Yeah.
So what inspired you to do this particular place? What was the aha moment? What I'm gonna do?
I had worked as an artist in residence at a place called the Center for Land Use Interpretation, which was in a very odd western town called Wendover, Utah. And while I was there, I met an Australian who was literally driving through in search of aliens. Why not? And so I met her, and she introduced me to the entire subject by happenstance. And I think artists, when they're being true to themselves, follow their impulses and their passions, and I followed that passion to Botany Bay, and I applied for the Fulbright, and I was lucky enough to win it and then spend time there. None of what you see here would happen without the long-term investment in building relationships, especially with the Aboriginal community, that would take, as another author had said, there's this act of dancing with strangers, that set of relationships and negotiations that you have to engage in over a long period of time in order to truly know people and a place. And so you can't kind of parachute in and then run out. That's abusive. So what I really wanted to do was find a place and return and return and return. But also every time upon returning, you come with your own cultural lens and your own aspect of engaging a space as an American, not as an Australian. So there were many things here that Australians who lived a couple kilometers about didn't even know about, that saw for the first time in my work, that they could have driven a couple streets over and seen, but had just ignored. And I could go out the back door here and probably have something introduced to me by somebody coming from abroad in a similar way. Yeah.
First, I'd like to second her comment on how beautiful your work is. And
Thank you.
how emotionally rapid it is. And I really liked your comment about you could do this in Curtis Bay, Great Salt Lake, that it is a universal theme.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering if you see your work playing a role, in addition to the documentation, in addition to the storytelling, in addition to making those personal connections with people, is there an activist role in this?
Oh,
Are people
certainly.
in Australia using your work in that way for remediation?
I found,
Here would be fence line.
yeah, I found myself at odds often with the environmental community, or sometimes in a place of being between two distrusting communities. And so the Aboriginal community was completely focused upon survival, cultural survival, survival of the language, survival of initiation. And so their needs were remarkably different than the people who were protesting a desal plant or chemical factories, chemicals leaching into the groundwater. And so there were certain times when I could be an agent or a recordist for that group, but I think I always had to own and synthesize my work for myself first before it was used by others. And I think as soon as you start to put your work as an artist to the service of others for advocacy, you lose a certain degree of your own integrity in the work. And so you have to advance the work through your own vision, because your own vision might reveal something that the advocate will not, because the advocate has a certain kind of axe to grind, if you will. It may not be as nuanced. It might be much more full-bore, quick and didactic and to the point, whereas this work is not meant to do that. It's meant to kind of enter into the emotional ear, enter into the eye and into your bloodstream for a while so that you feel the passion of the place or the horror of the place or whatever it is that connects you to it. Yeah.
What to you holds this collection together as a gallery instead of a photo essay or a case study?
Well, I think I talked about the way that the audio for me sort of permeates the whole space. It's sort of like, it's like climbing out of the shower and seeing the steam all around you. It's the thing that creates a sensation for me of being there. And in a way, the photographs are a direct reference, but they're sort of an index card referent to the place. Like it's in the same way that you take a great picture of that amazing meal that you just had, but you can't actually taste it. The sound in a way is getting to the oral, the sonic taste of the place for me. And so in that way, I think the sound for me was very necessary to restate what it was like to walk there, what it was like to hear certain kinds of birds in the morning but not to hear them in the afternoon, or certain kinds of waves at certain times and that sort of thing, or certain seasons you would hear cicadas, for instance, and then they would be gone when I came back in winter. So being there in January for summer was very different than being there in June for winter, for instance. And for an American, you get off that plane completely jet lagged, you drive on the wrong side of the road, you're in the wrong season, so you just feel your entire world has been destabilized, but you've also sort of rubbed your eyes and woken up and looked around and said, wow, look at that bird. Wow, look at that bird. You know, it's just, everything gets juiced up again. It reminds me of those YouTube videos where a baby gets eyeglasses for the first time and they're like, oh, wow, you know. So it needs that heightening in a way, and I think the sound does that. Yeah.
What kind of advice might you give to an artist who's also interested in going to other countries or continents and making not necessarily this work, but similar type of work?
You should look at exchange, definitely. As an undergraduate student or as a senior scholar, you can look at exchange programs like Fulbright, which provide you the in-country support and networks that you need and the financial wherewithal to actually spend the time on the ground for 6 months or a year so that you can really understand the culture and really be in the place. There are also, if you look online for Residencies Unlimited, you'll find residencies all around the globe as an artist where you can do on-location work in Iceland, Ireland, Thailand, everywhere, Antarctica. On a container ship, you can do a residency on a container ship now. You're all questioned out. Very good. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jessica.